In April of 2004, 24-year-old Alonzo Brooks attended a party in the rural, predominantly white town of Cygne, Kansas. The official police narrative states that Alonzo simply wandered off into the dark, got lost, and tragically succumbed to the elements. But this was no accident. Alonzo was murdered, the victim of a targeted hate crime, and the local authorities orchestrated a massive, sickening cover-up by pretending to search the area while turning a blind eye to the killers in their own backyard. The undeniable proof lies in the fact that the FBI recently exhumed his body and reclassified his death as a homicide. And even more damning, his own family found his body in under an hour, in a shallow creek. The police claim to have rigorously searched for weeks. Tonight, we are going to expose the terrifying timeline of Alonzo's disappearance, the impossible forensic anomalies of his discovery, and the infuriating wall of silence built by a justice system desperate to protect its own. Alonzo Brooks was, by all accounts from those who knew him, a gentle giant. At 6'2", he had a commanding presence, but his demeanor was famously easygoing. He lived in Gardner, Kansas, a suburb of Kansas City. He loved playing football. He adored his mother, Maria, and he was known for being the kind of friend who would drop everything to help someone in need. He was not a troublemaker. He had no criminal record. He was simply a 24-year-old man trying to navigate life, hanging out with his friends on a crisp spring weekend. On the evening of the 3rd of April, 2004, Alonzo piled into a friend's car. They were heading to a party at a farmhouse in Cygne, a small, isolated town in Linn County, Kansas, roughly an hour south of where Alonzo lived. Cygne is the kind of town where everyone knows everyone. It's tight-knit, rural, and overwhelmingly white. Alonzo was of Mexican and African-American descent when he and his friends arrived at the farmhouse. Alonzo was one of only 3 black men in a crowd of over 100 people. The atmosphere at the party was not welcoming. It was charged with a localized hostility. Witnesses later reported that almost immediately upon Alonzo's arrival, racial slurs were thrown in his direction. There were aggressive stares, whispered threats, and a palpable tension. Alonzo, staying true to his nature, tried to brush it off. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to hang out with the friends who brought him. But as the night wore on, alcohol flowed, and the undercurrent of bigotry began to surface violently. Alonzo was involved in a minor verbal altercation with a few local men. It wasn't a massive brawl, but it was enough to make the hostility undeniable. And then, the fatal mistake occurred. The friends who had driven Alonzo to the party ended up leaving at different times. One friend got lost on the dark country roads after making a run to buy cigarettes and never made it back to the farmhouse. Another friend assumed Alonzo had already caught a ride with someone else. Through a series of miscommunications and poor decisions, Alonzo was left completely alone, stranded in a hostile town, surrounded by people who had been hurling racial abuse at him just hours prior, with no cell phone and no way to get home. The next morning, Alonzo didn't return to Gardner. His mother, Maria, felt an immediate, sickening drop in her stomach. Mothers know. She knew her son would never just vanish without calling her. The Brooks family immediately contacted the authorities, expecting the swift, decisive action that taxpayers are promised in times of crisis. What they received instead was the first blatant symptom of a systemic rot that would define this case for the next 2 decades. The Linn County Sheriff's Office was lethargic. Their initial response was dismissive, treating Alonzo's disappearance not as a potential crime, but as the irresponsible behavior of a young man sleeping off a hangover. He's an adult, they told the family. He probably just met a girl or is walking off a drunk. This is the first failure of the system. The critical first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation, the window where evidence is fresh, memories are sharp, and tracks are visible, were entirely squandered by police apathy. It wasn't until days later, when the family's relentless pressure became a nuisance, that a formal search was finally initiated. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, and local law enforcement descended upon the Cygne farmhouse. They brought in tracking dogs. They brought in dive teams. They scoured the property, the surrounding woods, and crucially, Middle Creek, a shallow body of water bordering the farmhouse property. During these initial sweeps, investigators found something bizarre. Across the road from the farmhouse, in a completely different direction from the creek, they found Alonzo's boots and his hat. The boots were placed somewhat neatly. It didn't look like they had been thrown in a struggle. It looked staged. Why would a man walking home in the freezing dark of an April night take off his boots and hat? Despite this glaring red flag pointing to foul play, the police maintained their narrative. Alonzo got drunk, got disoriented, took his clothes off, a phenomenon sometimes associated with hypothermia, and wandered away. For nearly a month, the police told the Brooks family that they were doing everything in their power. They claimed to have searched Middle Creek exhaustively. They told Maria that her son was not on that property. They officially cleared the area. The authorities packed up their equipment, effectively closing the active search and leaving the family in an agonizing purgatory of unanswered questions. But the Brooks family refused to accept the empty platitudes of a police department that seemed eager to sweep them under the rug. They demanded to search the property themselves. For nearly a month, the owner of the farmhouse refused to let the family on the land. It wasn't until the 1st of May 2004, 27 days after Alonzo went missing, that the family was finally granted access to the property to conduct their own search. This is where the tragedy pivots into pure, unadulterated outrage. This is where the sheer incompetence, or worse, the malicious complicity of the Linn County Sheriff's Office is laid bare for the world to see. A massive group of Alonzo's family and friends arrived at the farmhouse on the morning of May 1st. They organized a line and began walking the property. They didn't have trained cadaver dogs. They didn't have scuba gear or sonar. They were just desperate, grieving people walking through the brush. They began their search at the edge of Middle Creek. Within 45 minutes, less than one single hour, a family member looked into the shallow water tangled with branches and brush and screamed. There, snagged on a pile of branches in the creek, was the body of Alonzo Brooks. Think about the profound horror of that moment. But then, think about the logistics. The police, the KBI, the trained divers, and the tracking dogs had allegedly scoured this exact creek just weeks prior. They had looked the Brooks family in the eye and told them the creek was clear. How does a grieving family find a body in 45 minutes that trained law enforcement professionals couldn't find in nearly a month? There are only two possible answers, and both are damning indictments of the justice system. Option A: the police are catastrophically, almost unimaginably incompetent. They simply didn't look. They walked the perimeter, checked a box, and lied to a mother's face to get out of doing their jobs. Option B: the body was not there when the police searched. As forensic experts and independent investigators began to look at the facts of the case, Option B became the chillingly obvious reality. When Alonzo's body was recovered, the medical examiner's report was another slap in the face to the family. The autopsy was frustratingly inconclusive. Because the body had been missing for a month, the coroner ruled the cause of death as undetermined due to advanced decomposition. However, the physical evidence on the body told a story that completely contradicted the police's accidental drowning theory. First, Alonzo had no broken bones. If he had stumbled into the creek in the dark and drowned, there would likely be signs of a struggle or injury from a fall. Second, his lungs did not show the classic signs of drowning. But the most glaring anomaly, the impossible fact that destroys the official narrative, was the condition of his body and his clothing. If a human body is submerged in a Kansas creek for 27 days, exposed to the elements, the water currents, and aquatic wildlife, the degradation is severe and highly specific. Alonzo's body did not match the forensic profile of someone who had been in the water for a month. Furthermore, his personal items, things in his pockets, were shockingly well preserved. Paper money in his pocket had not disintegrated. A piece of paper with a phone number on it was still legible. This is physically impossible if he had been submerged in flowing water for 4 weeks. The dark, undeniable conclusion, drawn by private investigators and later echoed by the FBI, is the cold storage theory. Alonzo Brooks did not die in Middle Creek. He was murdered on the night of the party, or shortly after. His killers, knowing the police would eventually search the area, hid his body in a freezer, a root cellar, or some other form of cold storage. They waited for the police to conduct their half-hearted search. They waited for the authorities to officially clear the area. And then, once the coast was clear, they took Alonzo's body and dumped it in the very creek the police had already checked, assuming it would never be searched again. They didn't account for the relentless love of a mother and a family who demanded to look for themselves. The police failure did not end with the botched search. Over 100 people attended that party. Over 100 people were packed into a rural farmhouse. Yet, when investigators conducted interviews, they were met with a staggering wall of silence. I didn't see anything. I don't remember. I left early. It is a statistical and logistical impossibility that a 6'2" man was brutally murdered, and his body transported away from a crowded party without a single person seeing, hearing, or knowing something. But Cygne closed ranks. The local community decided that protecting the local boys, the perpetrators of a racially motivated murder, was more important than justice for an outsider, and the local law enforcement allowed them to do it. The investigators failed to press the attendees. They failed to use the leverage of the law to break the silence. They accepted the I don't knows at face value and walked away. The case went cold, not because there were no leads, but because the authorities simply stopped pulling the threads. They prioritized the comfort and reputation of their small, predominantly white town over the life of a young man of color. For 15 agonizing years, Maria Brooks and her family fought a lonely war against a system that had completely abandoned them. The local police washed their hands of it. The state investigators moved on. Alonzo's killers walked the streets of Cygne, living their lives, getting married, having children, completely insulated by the blue wall of silence and community complicity. It wasn't until the explosive power of digital media and public outrage intervened that the system was forced to care. In 2020, the revival of the documentary series Unsolved Mysteries featured Alonzo's case. The episode laid bare the blatant corruption, the forensic impossibilities, and the racial undertones of the murder. The public response was deafening. Millions of viewers were outraged. The internet descended upon the case, demanding answers, signing petitions, and shining a blinding spotlight on the Linn County authorities. The embarrassment and public pressure became too much to ignore. The FBI, which had previously reviewed the case and quietly stepped back, suddenly reopened the investigation. They offered a $100,000 reward for information. In a move that validated every suspicion the Brooks family had held for 16 years, the FBI exhumed Alonzo's body in the summer of 2020. They brought his remains to Dover Air Force Base, where Armed Forces medical examiners conducted a new, state-of-the-art autopsy. The results were a devastating indictment of the original investigation. In April of 2021, the FBI officially announced what the Brooks family had known since the day they found him in the creek. Alonzo Brooks's death was a homicide. The new autopsy revealed blunt force trauma that the original, local coroner had either missed or chosen to ignore. The official ruling shattered the accidental drowning lie once and for all. While the FBI's involvement and the homicide ruling are steps toward justice, they are also glaring reminders of a broken machine. The system did not work. The system actively worked against Alonzo. It took a massive international television show and the screaming outrage of millions of strangers to force the federal government to do the job that the local police should have done in 2004. As of this recording, no arrests have been made. The killers are still out there, likely still shielded by the cowardly silence of the people who were at that party. The case of Alonzo Brooks is not just a tragedy. It is a terrifying case study in institutional rot. It shows us how easily evidence can be ignored, how quickly a search can be botched, and how a community can collectively agree to let a murderer go free simply because the victim wasn't one of their own. It proves that sometimes the badge doesn't mean protection. Sometimes it just means they have the power to look the other way. If you think a small town covering up a murder is infuriating, wait until you hear how a billionaire family used their influence to erase a double homicide right under the police's nose. Click the video on your screen to see the case they thought money could bury forever.